class snobbery. Class snobbery is similar to white privilege, but it is not the same thing. Judeo-Christian dogmatism looks like, acts like, very often produces many of the similar outcomes. But the privilege that is ascribed to people by the dogma of the Judeo-Christian philosophies is not the same as white privilege. The presumption of Anglo-hegemony, that is, that the world is all like the Anglo perspective of it, is similar to and has very similar consequences of white privilege, but it is not the same as white privilege. White privilege is a set of options, opportunities, and opinions. A set of options, opportunities, and opinions that are gained at the expense of non-white people. It is not just an issue of one-upmanship in any situation where there is a hierarchy. It is a very specific set of options that one is able to exercise, opportunities that one is able to have, and opinions that one is able to possess and impose that are systematically gained and maintained at the expense of people who are not white. Not because they're not female, not because they're not heterosexual, not because they're not Jewish, not because they're not Catholic, not because they're not a lot of other things, simply because they are not white. And these options, opportunities, and opinions are a direct consequence of the biological accident of color. And this biological accident of color is presumed to endow people with the access and the opportunities, the options, and the opinions that are special in this phenomena of white privilege. So what does it permit people to do? What does this white privilege thing permit white people to do? First of all, and probably most significantly, it permits white people to define reality as they see fit. They are able to define beginnings and endings as the point at which they entered or when they leave. So America, despite its thousands of years of preceding history, is actually begun at the moment they show up about 1,500 years ago, and America is suddenly discovered. The Aztec, the Incas, and the multiple cultural traditions that had populated this land for thousands of years before Europeans ever found their way out of the mythology that the world was flat and limited to a few square miles somewhere on the other side of the Atlantic, that somehow all of that was dismissed upon their appearance. And they then were able to decide that this place begins now because I am here. And as a consequence, that began to be what is called the discovery of America. Now, that serves a very important purpose for the people who claim that privilege. They then can freely engage in ignoring any reality which preceded their appearance and to begin to effectively eliminate any contradiction to their imposed redefinition of the reality that they've entered. So they can then wipe out any native inhabitants because they happen to be a nuisance obstacle to the fact that they really don't exist because existence begins when white people came in. So the process then of erasing these barriers and somehow clearing the land from these obstacles to this definition becomes a completely legitimate thing to do. This is not only true in terms of the definition of what America is, it is also true in terms of the definition of what world history is, what the classics are, what is the origin of thought, the beginning of philosophy, what is the original, prototype of whatever reality happens to be. To be able to claim what are the classics. In other words, what is the prototypical model? So you can't talk about science unless you begin with Greece. You can't discuss mathematics unless you begin with the Hellenistic period. You can't begin to talk about architecture, art, philosophy, religion, or any other arena of human thought unless you begin it where they began. So a part of this privilege then is to completely forget about the Oriental world that had its own philosophy, mathematics, scientific endeavors, and religious conceptions long before Europeans were able to deal with the rational processes of the working of the universe. Long before there was any conceptualization of healing in Europe, and even when there was no architecture other than the capacity to find shelter from the elements, that there were people in the Orient and people in Africa who had already conceptualized how to create models and forms consistent with their needs and to be able to replicate images of what nature had provided by creating workable models for one's own existence. But the way that that reality is eliminated, these privileged people decided to define something that they call history and prehistory. There is nothing more arrogant than to eliminate tens of thousands of years of human experience by calling it prehistory. So basically then, whatever was known before we started knowing was pre-knowledge. And knowledge only began when we began to know. The utter arrogance of that is without precedent. But it is in fact the foundation for most of the presumption that grows out of that kind of white privilege. To presume that there is no more basic information to have than information about me. To assume that there is no more important language to speak than my language. And to use my language, my experience, my history, my culture, my practices, my conduct as the norm for all humanity. For me to have peculiar relationships with my parents, and then to impose that on people around the world. Imagine people going into New Guinea looking for an Oedipus complex. Imagine the arrogance of people leaving their own European fragmented experience and going into the rest of the world, imposing the experience of penis envy, castration anxiety, and reinforcing circumstances to alter behavior on the world wherever they went. Strange stuff. But this is the stuff of white privilege. White privilege is the ability to raise your children and teach them legitimately race does not matter. To be able to raise your children to somehow not have to protect them from Santa Claus. To be able to raise your children and let them comfortably engage in the mythology that Santa Claus really is this magical creature who is a fat white man with a serious problem of obesity, who is able to move with immunity in and out of communities all over the world without any fear or trepidation of coming into the black neighborhood after dark on Christmas Eve and to be able to drop stuff off, take stuff out, and leave without being mugged.